All right. So very, very shortly after George Floyd was murdered, the anti-diversity movement began in earnest. And in fact, in July of 2020, one of our presenters, Howard Ross, who was the subject of a hit piece you may have heard of in the New York Post by conservative anti-CRT activist, I'm not even going to say his name. He's the same person who influenced President Trump to sign the September 2020 executive order, you might remember, called Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. Then the word woke was co-opted, right? For decades, it was a word that originated and had historically been used in the Black community, meaning informed, educated, conscious of social injustice and racial inequality. But once anti-racism looked like it was actually gaining some traction, it was turned into a pejorative umbrella term for inclusion and equity. Then we have in 2024, conservative activists, and most notably Robbie Starbuck, started to pressure companies to dismantle their diversity and inclusion structures and strategies by organizing boycotts and social media campaigns. Some companies have actually capitulated by publicly announcing rollbacks, though I believe, and I know a lot of people who believe, that many, if not most of these companies are still conducting the bulk of their inclusion work behind the scenes. They know how important it is. We've also seen shareholders of companies like Costco and Apple reject proposals to dismantle DEI. Now this year, since the new Trump administration took over in January, the president, of course, has signed several executive orders banning DEI work in the federal government, laying off thousands of people, rescinding affirmative action and non-discrimination requirements, requiring federal contractors and grantees to certify that they don't operate any illegal DEI programs, and requiring the U.S. Attorney General to create a plan that identifies specific target companies to go after when it comes to DEI programs that they believe are discriminatory. And by the way, that list is due 120 days after the executive order was signed, which was on January 21st. So day 120 is coming up soon in a month. That's May 21st. The president also signed several other executive orders that, for example, seek to erase transgender and non-binary Americans from existence, including withholding crucial gender-affirming care for individuals 18 years and under. And the president has also ordered the Office of Federal Contract Compliance and Programs, CCP, to stop enforcement of President Lyndon Johnson's 1965 executive order on equal employment opportunity. That's the one that prohibited race, color, religion, sex, or national origin employment discrimination by federal contractors and mandated affirmative action to promote equal opportunity. So at this point, a lot of companies who had appeared to be committed to inclusion and diversity have, this is what we've seen, have either scaled back or paused, if you will. I've heard the word paused so much in the last several months. Their programs, initiatives, and funding, and really in many cases greatly reduced their DEI-focused personnel. At the same time, everywhere around us, the media, the ether is filled with misconceptions and misinformation about what inclusion is, what equity is, what diversity is. So let's start a conversation by talking about the current landscape for organizations, what they're doing or avoiding doing, for example, in this environment. And so I'm going to start by asking Chuck a question, which is kind of looking at the current DEI landscape. What shifts have you observed in how organizations are approaching inclusion work in 2025 compared to even like a year ago?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rebecca, and for the kickoff as well. Thank you for everybody for joining, and I really want to give a big shout out to Howard Ross for taking his time to join us this afternoon. at LCW, we started to see budgets for DEI work reduced throughout 2024 over concerns of kind of the earlier predicted deep economic recession. That recession turned out not to be as deep as predicted, but companies certainly did not return to their post George Floyd commitments. In 2025, of course, we have, as Rebecca called out, a war on DEI by the current administration, which is being enforced by way of threats of litigation and fines for civil rights violations and loss potentially of government contracts to those organizations that have them. Companies, our clients, as well as some of the folks that we read about, are understandably moving with incredible caution. Some have even publicly abandoned previous commitments to DEI. I'm looking at you, Target. I've talked to many clients who are putting work on what they call strategic pause or canceling work completely, at least until they get their hands around what all this means for them and their people. And just to quickly respond to your question about misconceptions, right? Those misconceptions are purposeful. Let's just call that out immediately. The misconceptions are being weaponized in the same way quote unquote affirmative action was once mischaracterized and weaponized. It is the belief that undeserving and unqualified workers from historically marginalized groups are being given advantages that disadvantage folks from the historical majority, right? One would need to ignore demonstrative disparities in unemployment rates between groups. You would need to ignore disparities of management representation as a reflection of workforce representation or participation. And you would need to ignore the continued lack of penetration at the executive level by these marginalized groups to believe any of this, right? And so I would certainly ask Howard if he has any color that he wants to add in terms of the mischaracterizations that he's hearing with regards to DEI and the efforts that are taking place right now.
Sure. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks for having me, and hi everybody. It is a challenging time. There's no question about it. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to, Chuck, is that this is not a rational conversation. It's not an honest conversation. And so when we try to sort this stuff out rationally, of course, it doesn't make any sense. Anybody who looks at the demographics as you're describing knows that there's a different narrative being told than the actual factual data that we have. But that's not unusual for human beings. There's a lot of, I made my name in the business talking about how irrational people are. One of the great quotes that I always remember is from John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, who said that most human beings, given a strongly held point of view and evidence to the contrary, will quickly go about refuting the evidence. And I think that's the state that we're in. So we're dealing with not a negative assessment of the facts. We're dealing with a negative assessment that's designed to produce a result, and therefore is not necessarily related to the facts.
Yeah.
Excellent. I just to kind of add something to that is I also feel like the conversation from the anti-DEI population, the messaging is very simple, DEI is about discrimination against people of majority groups. And that becomes part of an ideology, as you said, Howard, that's really hard to refute with facts. And so what can we do to oppose that or to push back against that?
Well, I do think that what you're talking about is really important, Rebecca. Because this has been a moving target. I mean, as you said, I was attacked in July 2020, now the claim is that this anti-DE&I terrorist campaign, which is really what it is because of anti-Semitism on campuses. But the campaign started years before the Israel-Gaza demonstration. So we know that that's nonsense. But I do think it's important for us to look at this from the standpoint of what we're really dealing with. I read a survey, and it was probably about 2 months ago now. People went around and asked people what DEI means, and 72% of the people questioned didn't know what DEI meant. So I think, what they've done is, the guy who went after me, Christopher Rufo, did the same thing with critical race theory at some point. He even said publicly, what we're going to do is we're going to throw everything bad we can think about at this word, whether it's relevant or not. So we say airplanes are falling out of the sky and bridges are falling because of DE&I. And once people buy into this, then sure, see, there's another example. I do think that it would serve us as a community to start using the words rather than the acronym, because that generates a greater conversation. If we say, we're practicing diversity, equity, inclusion, people say, I don't like that. Say, which of them don't you like and why? All of a sudden there's a different conversation rather than getting stuck in it. But
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Becca.
No, I was just going to say, I've actually been hearing that more and more from a larger and larger group of folks from our industry. And I think that that's sticking, because I think that sometimes using the acronym, those aren't words. And so it's much easier to disparage an acronym than it is words with meaning, right?
That's right. And we know that the extreme right has done a really good job of using language to their advantage. The defense of marriage, campaign in California, which was, of course, an anti-marriage campaign against LGBTQ people, but nonetheless is positioned as a defense of marriage campaign. But I do think, all of this stuff always occurs both internally and externally. There's the external stuff that's going on we have to deal with. But I think it's also important for us as practitioners to look at how attached we get to the language. I have a little advantage in that regard, because when I started in this industry, I think I gave my first paid diversity workshop in 1985. There was no E&I. And in fact, I remember giving a talk at a bank in DC right around that time. And I was 5 minutes into the talk and somebody raised his hand and said, well, when are we going to get to the diversification of stock portfolios? Because he had no idea what the term diversity even meant. So the language for me has always been rolling and moving. And I think what we sometimes, so part of this is ego attachment that we have. We don't want people to take our words away. And part of it is that we know the words are important, and I'm not meaning to diminish that. But some of it is also just this sense that I think in a lot of cases, we've forgotten sort of the basic thrust, which is that this was never about DE&I. It was never about any of that. It was about creating workplace environments in which everybody could thrive, everybody could have opportunity, everybody could be treated with a
All
sense of
groups,
equity.
right.
And so, if we remember that, then we can begin to see alternatives.
Absolutely. Right. A lot of clients, a lot of companies are definitely being careful, maybe, I would say somewhat justifiably risk averse in this environment. And thus the pauses that Chuck was mentioning. But speaking of language, I want to ask you, Howard, we're seeing organizations shift their terminology from diversity, equity, inclusion to other things, focusing on so many different things, but engagement or effectiveness or talent optimization, psychological safety, although that's not new, but and it's definitely a very important part of DEI or belonging. And so kind of beyond semantics, how can organizations authentically continue to work while at the same time navigating these political sensitivities?
Sure. Well, yeah, but let me just say this as a way to answer that question. We as human beings are really interesting in lots of ways. And one way is that we develop a commitment to something, and then we develop a strategy to get to that commitment. And if we're not careful, our commitment shifts from the ultimate commitment to the strategy. So I have a friend, for example, who started running. I think I shared this story with you when we were prepping. Started running because she wanted to get healthy in her late 40s or 50. She became a marathon runner and then did that for about 20 years. And then all of a sudden started to get a lot of hip pain, but she was committed to running marathons. It kept going until she blew out her hip, and now she can't run at all, right? Had she remembered that she was committed to her health and well-being when she started to get a hip pain, maybe she would have switched to swimming. And I think similarly, we have to remember that DE&I was always a strategy. As I was saying earlier, it was a strategy to get to where we're going. And for a lot of people, our shift has been to that strategy rather than remembering what it's really about. So if we can remember what we're really trying to do, then some of the other alternatives you're talking about actually aren't selling out. They're just putting new language to doing the same thing. You know, for example, I was talking to one of the practitioners who is a mentee of mine who does a lot of work on unconscious bias, and he's now talking about promoting his work as making better decisions. And he's doing virtually the exact same workshops that he was done, but focusing on the decision-making aspect of that, which is ultimately at the heart of it anyway, as opposed to focusing it so much on the ism aspect of it, that we might call the ism aspect of it, the
Mm-hmm.
identity aspect of it. And he's finding that people are still open, and while some people are backing off, he can still do it. So I think it's a time for us to be really creative in terms of how we use language to combat the way they're using language.
And language evolves in every respect, right? So we have, the word liberal actually originally meant somebody who valued liberty and individual rights. And in the 80s and 90s, it started to mean people who believed in, progressive values. And so the language switched from liberal to progressive. And that's just what language does, right? Kind of growing with the culture and with people's needs. Chuck, do you have anything that you would like to add around the language piece?
I think Howard is spot on. I think we have to be outcome driven. We are after the outcomes, not the process, not the procedure, not the language itself. We're after specific outcomes and creating equitable workspaces where people can give their best, be their best, and do their best all the time. And whether you call it peanut butter or whether you call it DEI or something else, it really shouldn't matter. I know people who are 10 toes down for DEI. They don't want to give it up, like
Yeah.
they gave up CRT, like they gave up liberal, like they gave up, and they will expend a lot of energy defending that when the objective should be making sure that we're creating those equitable workspaces, period.
And by the way, if anybody has any ideas or would like to share around the topics that we're talking about, please feel free to raise your hand or share in the chat. And if you have specific questions, if something you want to get out of this conversation that you feel that I haven't asked or we haven't touched, please write it down, because that's more important to us than the questions that we actually have pre-prepared, right? Okay, so there's this kind of thread around terminology and language. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard the term MEI, right? And saying we want merit, excellence, and intelligence, MEI, not DEI, suggesting that kind of these are somehow incompatible, right? So my question to you, Chuck, is how would you respond to executives, leaders who position MEI as an alternative to DEI? And what strategies can practitioners use to demonstrate that inclusion actually enhances merit-based systems rather than undermining them?
Yeah, thank you. I think inherent in the assumption or the assertion that merit should reign supreme over DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion is the fact that that's not part of what DEI is or diversity, equity, inclusion is, right? I would suggest it's impossible to have a merit-based system without inclusion. It is impossible to curate a merit-based organization without acknowledging what we know about cognitive bias and brain science and working to mitigate the effects on talent decisions. It's impossible to determine who is the most worthy or deserving or rises to a level of excellence needed for a specific role if the pool you are choosing from is narrowed not because of capabilities, but is actually narrowed because of fair and honest consideration, right? At the end of the day, merit is exactly what DEI has been trying to achieve all along. Merit's critically important and would be legitimate if everyone had the same access and opportunity. But we know that they don't. If bias and privilege did not exist, but we know that it does. The evidence says that we must work to debias our people systems, our people evaluations, and proactively look for talent in a variety of places. I read a very smart article yesterday by Hakeem Jeffersons, not Jeffries. He is an assistant professor at political science at Stanford. He wrote an article in the Stanford Daily, if you want to look this up. The article was actually a response to an earlier article in the Daily that suggested that DEI had no place at Stanford. In the article, in the original article, the author recalled this glossy, romanticized yet completely ahistorical post-World War II world where equality abounded for anyone who was willing to work hard, regardless of their background. Of
Right.
course, Professor Jefferson equally dismantled that, using facts, using data, using research. But on the way in doing so, he said something that really kind of hit me with regards to the current state, and that is DEI does not threaten merit, it threatens monopoly. That's what all of this is about. Certain groups for generations enjoyed a monopoly on interviewing, hiring, and promoting for available positions, and there are folks deeply invested in returning back to those days. I would really recommend that you read the article. It's a wonderfully written article with some great facts to refute this kind of romanticized past of equity and equality.
If I could
Yeah,
jump in, if I could jump in for
please,
a second,
please.
Rebecca,
Thank you, Chuck. That was really insightful.
yeah, it's very, very right on target, Chuck. You know, one of the things this leaves us with is a sense of, you know, how do we interact with people when the message that's being stated is not the actual message that's being delivered? So when people talk about MEI, you know, and it reminds me for years, you know, I would interact with people and, you know, we would talk about affirmative hiring practices of various kinds, and people would say, oh, that's fine as long as we don't lower our standards. I'm sure
Yeah.
everybody here who does DEI work has always heard that. And that for me, while it was frustrating, was also a huge opening because rather than respond like this, which my soul wanted to do, my social justice activist side wanted to do, I would often stop and say, "Wow, that's really interesting. What is it that makes you think that hiring more people of color requires lowering our standards?"
Right.
And then there would be this fumbling voice, and I'd say, you know, it seems to me that the only way you would think that is if you automatically assume that people of color are less talented. Do you believe that? You know, and then similar, I had a conversation with somebody about this MEI stuff recently.
Mm.
They said, we want to hire based on merit. I said, what kinds of things? He says, well, for example, education. How much education have they completed? So I said, well, that's really interesting. So your company would have really suffered if you would have hired Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, or Paul Allen, all of whom dropped out of college after only a year or two. And they clearly wouldn't meet your merit standards. How would that work? You know, and of course, once again, if I think this is something that I know for myself, I'm sure that other people can relate to what I'm talking about. I can get so triggered by this and get stuck into my own righteousness that rather than holding back for a bit and asking the question that draws out the confusion or the hypocrisy in their own statements, I I jump right in and they get into defensive mode. And actually, there's a psychological phenomenon. I think they call it the backtrack phenomenon, where if somebody has a point of view, you give them countering information, they'll actually dig in deeper. So the point that you made, for example, Rebecca, you know, MAGA, Make America Great Again. When was America ever great for Black people?
Mhm.
You know, for example, so the contradictions are there if we're asking the right questions. And I think especially now, that's where we need to be going, is really looking at what are the right questions to ask. Because if we get into a tit for tat, you know, banging heads with each other, we know that very
Yeah,
rarely
that's a
results.
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and asking questions, I think, is a great strategy because it encourages people to uh, explain where they're coming from and the why. And I also think it's really important to ask questions assuming positive intent. The last thing we want to do is raise the temperature. So just continuing to ask a question. And so if you are talking about merit, I think a worthwhile question is, so what is merit to you? What does merit mean? And we often hear, you know, it's effort, it's hard work, it's talent, it's skills. Great, I agree. Let's talk about what those talents are, what those skills are. What does effort mean to you behaviorally? How are we rewarding the people in our teams based on this definition of merit? Let's get specific. And let's see if we're actually using the same criteria when it comes to evaluating folks and making promotions, making the decisions around who gets to lead our teams and our organization. It's about fairness, right? Nobody's against fairness.
right.
So Howard, I would like to ask you, start with you for our next question, which is for organizations that are committed to inclusion, like we all are in this group, but we're facing either internal or external pressure to scale back. What specific strategies would you recommend to create sustainable, resilient diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that can try to withstand political cycles?
Sure. I think, first of all, I think we need to realize that there are various levels of what we call the opposition to this work. And I think it's really important that we not homogenize that, because there are people who are anti-DEI. They're just part of this campaign. By the way, we were talking about language before. I think it's important to say, in the same way that you were talking about the term liberal, that the term conservative has nothing to do with this movement. This is not a conservative movement. This is a radical restructurist movement, and we have to make sure that we don't allow people to use the term conservative without challenging it for that reason. So that's big. So we got the people who are hardcore against it. We got people who are always kind of lukewarm about it. And the truth is that, you know, they're not strongly committed either way. We've got people who are still committed to it and are afraid and have to be either that or are dealing with realistic limitations that are put on them, especially financially. Large organizations where if they don't do this, they'll have to lay off thousands of people in some cases, and they're making those determinations for self-protection. And then, of course, we've got people who support the work but feel like they can't. So it's important for us to understand what we're dealing with in the organization. Then I think the second thing is to look at what goals do we have? So if the goal is, I want everybody in this organization to have a fair opportunity, an equitable chance to be successful, a chance to have a seat at the table, all these kinds of things that we advocate, of course, then that's what we should be talking about. Not DEI, but not the language that can trigger people. And this is hard sometimes, is egos, because sometimes we'd rather be right than be effective. This is a time when we really need to be careful about, as Chuck said, looking at outcomes, what's going to make a difference here. And in that sense, we can start to talk, okay, this is what we're trying to build. How do we avoid these barriers, et cetera? We start doing that. Secondly, our third, I think it's important that we take care of ourselves as practitioners, that well-being is not an indulgence. You know, there's that wonderful Audre Lorde quote, which I won't try to quote word for word, but when she says that self-care is not self-indulgence, it's a radical act. And if we're, you know, I like to say that it's a bit like when you're on the airplane and they talk about the mask coming down, they always say, put it on your face before you worry about your child, because if you pass out, you're not going to be able to help your child, right? So that's an important one. The third is, I forget my numbers. The next one is, how do we stay close to the people we need to stay close to so that we're in community? Community is critically important. I was down at the march on April 5th. I was down at the mall because I live in Shenandoah Valley, west of DC. So we went down to the mall. We expected 20,000 people. There were 125,000, and it was jubilant. I mean, the mood was jubilant, and it's not because the situation externally changed. It was because we realized we were in community, and being in community is something that human beings need. It strengthens us. It gives us hope. It gives us a sense of possibility. It breaks us out of our individual or personal depression or slowness about that. And so that's really important. And then finally, that each of us has to decide what we can do to contribute both to our organizations and to the community action that's going on. And be careful not to judge each other, because what can happen at these times, particularly in times when people feel a sense of hopelessness, is we withdraw internally, start pointing fingers at each other. And you're seeing that now. And people say, well, you're selling out by not using equity, and you're doing, there's a lot of that internecine stuff going on, which is really dangerous and actually plays right into the hands of the anti-DEI terrorism campaign. So those are a few things quickly off the top of my head.
Thank you. And before we get Chuck's view on that, would love for you to share, if you can, what you're hearing in your organizations in terms of, what are the things that you're hearing, you all being DEI leaders, around going forward, around what you had budgeted to do this year, around inclusion? What are the challenges that you're facing around this topic? At any rate, Chuck, would love to hear what you have to say around, what we can do to.
I co-sign everything that Howard just said, and would suggest that when this first started, when the executive orders began to come in mass earlier in the year, I had an opportunity to talk to a couple of dozen of our clients, and three or four brave ones, courageous ones, really. I think in a moment of self-reflection said, you know what, as I think about this, we have probably left open too many doors to the people who walk through them with ill intent, right? Which is we hired too many people too fast, some of which were not qualified to do this work, right? And didn't support them. They didn't get support internally within their organizations. They didn't find support external to those organizations. We kind of stopped using data as much because those people didn't have the experience with data and so on. And quite frankly, as I had one diversity leader tell me, she had someone come up to her, or a white middle-aged guy, said, I see all this work you guys are doing. I just don't feel like you're talking to me. Right. And so the other thing I would suggest in terms of how to create kind of that sustainability, that resiliency in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs is expand the dimensions of differences that you're talking to and talking about within your organizations. How many of us talk about neurodiversity? How many of us talk about veterans, religion, right? Working parents, those things that are beyond the traditional kind of race, sex, gender, or sexual orientation and the such. Just making sure that we're creating an environment where people feel heard, feel seen, and feel part of the conversation, I think can help us withstand not just this storm, but the next storm as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think if I could add, I think that there's, by the way, I was just reading Francesca's note that being jubilant may be hard. You're right, no question about it. And I don't mean that we're inured to it. I guess, I just, recently, a friend of, I don't know, some of you may know Parker Palmer, who is a philosopher and poet and a remarkable guy. And Parker is an elder in my life, has been for a number of years. And I was talking with him, and he sent me this quote from, I'm not going to take the time to pull it up from my phone right now, but it was a quote from Sojourner Truth. And she said basically, I'm not going to let them steal my joy. I'm going to keep fighting against it, but I'm not going to let them steal my joy. And I think that I was talking to Dr. Johnetta Cole, who's my friend and mentor and somebody I've worked with for 20 years, who sits over my shoulder here like Jiminy Cricket, whispering in my ear, James Baldwin on the other side. And we were talking about the fact that when I got involved in civil rights when I was 15 years old, so that would have been 1966. She's, of course, about 13 years older than me, so she was involved long before that. But there was this sense of we were up to something special and there was a joy in the battle. It wasn't like we didn't know what we were fighting against, but there was a sense. I mean, remember, this was the time when civil rights workers had been killed in Jackson, in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So that joy was there. So I think that we do have to look at ourselves and what we bring to this in terms of being practitioners and being advocates. One is I think we have to have patience at a time like this, and having a historical perspective, I think, is helpful. Being my age, I've seen this for so long. I know it's always been 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And while this may be the worst, it's not the first time we've seen that retrenchment. So I think it's important for us to understand that and keep it in a historical context. We've got somebody who worked with me at Cook Ross, who worked in the Obama administration, and talked about how when the first Trump election happened, Obama called everybody, his political appointees together on a conference call. This was before Zoom was so prevalent, and said to them, look, this is a moment of time in a long history of this issue. I think that's really important. And the other is that I think most of us as diversity practitioners, I know this is certainly true for me, wear 2 hats. One is the hat of being the advocates, the social justice advocates, and many of us do that in our spare time as well as in our work time. And especially now, a lot of people are engaging in that. And then the other is being a change agent. And both of those are important, but the skills and the way we approach it are very different. If you're working in an organization and you come off as an advocate, then you're actually can be seen as choosing sides in the organization and lose the other half of the people there. As change agents, our job is really to hold the whole organization and the whole system and have it work. And so that sometimes means backing off a little bit from our own position so that we can allow some of the people that you've been talking about, some of the white guys who felt disaffected or didn't feel like it included them, and even some of the strategies we use that were, we talk about we use the term diverse to describe a person of color. Well, I have a diverse hire. And we reinforce that in our language. So then when we ask people to volunteer for diversity committees, white guys may not show up because they don't think that includes them. And we don't even realize that our language is inadvertently reinforcing that. So I think it always starts by looking with awareness of ourselves and seeing what we can contribute, because that's always at least under our control.
Yeah, the
Thank you.
meeting people where they are component is really important, Howard. Is we may be at a certain place in terms of our capacity to communicate across differences and collaborate with differences, but not everyone is there, right? And making the assumption that you can kind of grab people and pull them is probably wrong. What I think you need to do is create a gravitational pull that brings people to those kinds of initiative and activities, as well as the folks who need to be there as champions.
Absolutely.
And
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
no, I was just going to say, since Chuck brought it up, we are going to be emailing everybody who attended today a guide that we just created called Navigating Inclusion Conversations, a practical guide to meeting people where they are, which has examples. It's not very long, and it actually shows you what words to use. So I just wanted to mention that. I
Great.
also wanted to say that I know we said that this conversation would take 45 minutes, and we are at the 43-minute mark. If you can stay, fantastic. I just got a great question in the chat, and I'm just going to ask it. I think it's a really great question. It's from somebody who is in learning and development, and they produced an e-learning video and had to buy like stock images of people of color because their company didn't have people of color. And then when this person tried to start the conversation about what the company was actually doing to increase representation, it didn't go anywhere. And they just wanted the learning to appear diverse. And so as practitioners, how do we get beyond the surface focus? How do we go beyond, this superficiality of appearing a certain way without actually doing anything as an organization?
Well, I'm
Please go
sorry.
ahead, Howard. I will add color to it.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, Chuck, picking up on your last comment, I think this is something incredibly, when you talked about creating a gravitational pull, I would say that this work is now, has always been, and will always be enrollment work.
Mhm.
You
Yep.
can't force people to change the way they think. And particularly post George Floyd, we forgot that. We went back to the old days. When I started in the 80s, there was a lot of in your face kind of stuff. I used to call them find them and fix them trainings. Okay, who's the racist, who's the sexist, and we're going to fix you, Gee, big surprise that people went like this, right? And after George Floyd, a lot of folks returned to that. We even started saying things like, being liberal is worse than being an overt racist. Well, it's just silly when you look at it on the surface. And so I think we have to be really careful about that. And so I think the kinds of things that we need to do are enrollment based. How can we invite people into the conversation? How can we encourage people to feel like it's safe for them to share what they're actually feeling? Because if they don't share what they're actually feeling, any work you engage with them is going to be surface work anyway. So I think it again, it lives in the inquiry that we're willing to be in, how we're willing to suspend judgment, how we're willing to open up to see the humanity inside the other person, even though their point of view may be different than ours.
Yeah. Yeah, well said, well said. Yeah, I think the superficiality of it, I think, to get back to your question, Rebecca, is one that I think we all struggle with, but I do believe that there is another level. The work as I see it, right, is how do we help people communicate, collaborate, and succeed across differences, right? Ultimately, that's the goal with regards to the business mission that we're given by our clients. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things that we like to be outcomes socially, personally, and those kinds of things. But for businesses, it's about helping people work together to accomplish the goals of the business itself. And I think if you start with the end in mind, it helps you a lot in terms of helping get you to that point. And I think you brought up a phrase earlier that we like to use at LCW a lot, starting with positive intent, right? In every conversation, assuming positive intent. As a manager of people, I think the largest team I ever managed was 42, 48 people across 3 or 4 different countries. And one of the things I had to learn very quickly was to assume positive intent with each one of them, and that it was my job. If people weren't doing their best job, it was my job as their manager to remove the obstacles in their way, right? To help them be successful. And so I think as we think about being practitioners, moving beyond the superficial things to really getting down to the core mission of what we're trying to accomplish, I think each individual organization might have a degrees of difference in that. But I think ultimately what they're trying to get to is helping people succeed across those differences, helping them collaborate and communicate across those differences, however those differences are defined in your organization, right? And they might be different from one organization to another, from one nationality to another, from one region to another. But I think that's one of the key concepts. Howard?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on. I think you're right on target. I think we can't say it enough. To start with the end in mind is so important that we're remembering what we're actually trying to create here. This gives us an opportunity to take new data. For example, let's say your organization has backed off from their DE&I commitment. That's likely showing up somewhere. It may show up in your customers. It may show up in the amount of, so getting that data can be really helpful to go and say, look, we've noticed since we backed off on our DE&I commitment that the percentage or the amount, the number of African American and Latino customers that we have has dropped. Any suggestions? I'm saying this to my boss now. Any suggestions as to how we deal with that? You know, and drop
Yeah.
it in their lap and let them struggle with the issue as well, rather than coming in with solutions. Come in with the things that you want to do that they can then say yes or no to. Bring the actual inquiries there, and let's face it, if we've been saying this for a long time, we've got to use the business case. We use the business case for a long time to our advantage, and we made it clear to people where the labor force was coming from, where the workforce was coming from, what the work culture was going to be like, and how it was affected. But after a while, a lot of diversity practitioners got tired of having to cite the business case over and over again, and even resentful about having to cite the business case over again, as opposed to realizing it's an important and an effective tool, because ultimately the business of business is business. So I think we have to get back to basics a little bit and really focus on that in the context of how it plays out on a daily basis in our organization.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
like that,
great.
Howard. And I do think that younger workers are looking for mission-driven organizations to work for that align to their values, right? But I don't think that we throw the business case out in the chasing of that, right? We can do both. We can talk about the values and
Because
the
it's
mission of the
true.
organization
Mhm.
and that being important, and the business of the business, right? To your point.
Right.
Yeah, and to the person who asked the question, thanks for asking it. It could be that the people that you work with truly believe that there is a process in place for hiring folks in your team that is best based on merit, and it's based on hiring the best person, and maybe they truly believe they're being equal opportunity, and so it's a blind spot. So what could you do to lead by example? I know you have a day job, but what could you do to look for highly qualified talent that maybe exists in places that the folks that usually do the hiring don't exist? And you can bring them ideas for these resumes, these folks, and try to advocate to include these folks in the conversation so that these blind spots are opened, right, about how this talent exists.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that we've got access to amazing data very quickly right now. So one of the things that we can also do is to, like, let's say somebody says, well, I'm against DEI because it's been all about hiring only people of color and white guys haven't been hired. My response might be, wow, that's interesting. That's different than the data I've seen. Do you mind if we take a minute and drop some of this data and we go into one of the AI functions or whatever you use for your research data and say, can you please give me the demographic breakdown of C-suite officers in corporations in the United States today based on race. And so I get that data back and say, well, this is really interesting because you're saying that, but it says here that 92% of the people who are in these positions are white males. So how does that match up to what you just said? I'm confused. See, all of a sudden we're in a different conversation. We're not in this conversation. We're just like, look, this is what the data says. And I think that
Yeah.
kind of creative use of information that we have accessible to us right now can be helpful in these circumstances. Now, somebody who's an overt racist, the most extreme, you're never going to reach with that stuff. But I think that we have to stop targeting everything towards as if everybody on the other side is, Trump or Rufo or these kinds of people. They're not. In fact, what the latest poll I saw showed that 52% of Americans still support DE&I. Only 31% are hardcore against it, and the rest are sort of lukewarm. We still actually got a majority, so we're being dominated by a radical minority who's trying to shove this down our throat. And the more we can, and somebody else said humor is a big piece of this too, the more we can discharge some of that intense energy and get people to be more thoughtful, we're not going to reach the extremes, but we might reach those people in the middle who are now leaning in that direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I had put in the chat just a couple of things. So kind of going with what Howard mentioned about the business case, just 4 things, right, that we could continue to do to navigate through political conversations, always, continue to connect DEI initiatives directly to tangible business metrics, employee retention, innovation, market expansion. How does DEI work impact the business? Appeal to fairness and ethics without political framing, and maybe develop a tiered approach. So meaning, what are some initiatives that are non-negotiable that we always keep? It could be around, our performance reviews or our hiring process, and then flexible components can then be added to that without abandoning the fundamental principles of what we're trying to do. So I know that we are way past time. I would like to thank everybody for coming and for being very patient with our timing here. We really appreciate it. And we will be following up with that guide that I mentioned. Please feel free to connect with myself or Chuck or Howard, and have a great rest of your day and week.